To me, then, Christianity is a bleak doctrine, one that has preached hatred, soaked the earth with blood, and filled the mind with supernatural terrors. I sincerely hope that it is false. Why then do I regard it as in fact false? St. Paul laid it on the line. In 1 Corinthians 15:14, he says, "If Christ was not raised, then our gospel is null and void." Ladies and gentlemen, I do not believe that Christ was raised from the dead, so I regard the gospel that proclaims him as null and void. My argument against the resurrection is simple. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The purported resurrection of Jesus is about as extraordinary as a claim can get. The evidence in favor of the resurrection is not good, so we shouldn't believe it. It is just a matter of common sense that we should place a high burden of proof on extraordinary claims. Suppose I had opened this talk by saying, I just flew in from Chicago, and boy, are my arms tired. Surely you would demand very good reason indeed before you regarded this as anything other than an ancient joke. Suppose that the Reverend Billy Graham solemnly assured you that the cow in the nursery rhyme really did jump over the moon. Surely you would demand hard evidence for such an outrageous claim, even coming from so respected and trustworthy a source. Once more then, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So why do I say that the alleged resurrection of Jesus was so extraordinary? Well, surely if we know anything about the world, we know that dead people tend to stay dead. Otherwise, why should we see irony in the following notice from our Department of Social Services? Dear sir, you will no longer receive food stamps because our department has received word of your death. You must inform us in writing within 30 days if there is a change in your circumstances. Sorry, folks. Why are the reports of Elvis sightings material for the supermarket tabloids? Because we all rightly are very skeptical of reports of the resuscitations of corpses. The New Testament reports of Jesus' post-mortem appearances are even more extraordinary. Jesus was supposedly resurrected, not just resuscitated. His supernatural resurrected body could suddenly appear and disappear and pass through solid walls and doors into closed rooms. Surely a resurrected Jesus would be far more extraordinary than even a resuscitated Elvis. Here you might respond, wait a second, Parsons. Of course you atheist, are extremely skeptical of the resurrection. Like other unbelievers, you reject the whole concept of the miraculous, and you display a touching faith in the so-called laws of nature. I, however, you might say, believe in a God who can alter or suspend such laws at will. After all, the laws of nature don't tell us how things must behave, only how they usually do behave, unless, that is, God chooses that they behave differently. Therefore, you might say to that evil atheist Parsons, I do not have to rate the plausibility of miracle reports nearly as low as you do. But even if you believe in God, and even if you believe that miracles do occur, you must admit that the truth of any particular miracle report is initially most unlikely. After all, miracle reports come a dime for a dozen. Hucksters and hoaxers abound, as do false prophets and false religions. So there will be very many specious miracle reports. As a glance at the New Age or occult section of any bookstore shows you, humans have a strong inclination to believe the extraordinary over the mundane. This is why we must repeatedly inculcate the maxim, when you hear hoofbeats in the distance, think, aha, horses, not aha, unicorns. So, whether we are theist or atheist, our initial attitude towards any particular miracle claim must be that it is extremely implausible. This does not mean that evidence cannot, in principle, establish a miracle claim. It doesn't even mean that human testimony can never establish such a claim. It does mean that the burden of proof on miracle claimers must be very heavy. As David Hume put it in his famous miracle maxim, when someone claims a miracle, we should demand that their testimony be so trustworthy that its falsehood would be an even bigger miracle than the miracle they are claiming. Does the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus meet this heavy burden of proof? Nearly all of the so-called evidence comes from the four canonical Gospels, but let's be honest. What confidence can we have in documents, 1, authored by persons unknown, clearly not eyewitnesses, 2, written 4 or more decades after the events they purportedly described, 3, drawn upon oral traditions, and hence subject to the unreliability of human memory, 4, each with a clear theological bias and apologetic agenda, 5, containing many identifiably fictitious literary forms, 6, inconsistent with each other except where one gospel plagiarizes another, 7, at odds with known facts, 8, with virtually no support from independent sources, and 9, testifying to events which in ordinary circumstances we would regard as unlikely in the extreme. Well, Professor Craig believes that there are 3 main points of evidence that support the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus: the post-mortem appearances, the empty tomb, and the origin of the Christian faith. In my remaining time, I shall explain why I reject each of these pieces of purported evidence. The postmortem appearances. Professor Craig places much emphasis upon the formula recited by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, where Paul lists various alleged witnesses of the risen Jesus. Cephas, Simon Peter, the 12, over 500 at once, James, Jesus' brother, all of the apostles, and finally Paul himself. This passage is important because it is very early. It names or refers to numerous alleged witnesses of Jesus, the risen Jesus, and it purports to give Paul's own testimony, the only undisputed first-person report of an encounter with Jesus in the entire New Testament. First, the early date of the formula is irrelevant. Contrary to a claim frequently made by Professor Craig and other apologists, legends can and do spread almost immediately, despite the opposition of eyewitnesses, and sometimes even with the connivance of eyewitnesses. Consider Elvis and Bigfoot sightings, Bermuda Triangle disappearances, alien abductions, crash saucer stories, and other such goofy legends. Such stories spread quickly, often despite the testimony of eyewitnesses and the efforts of would-be debunkers. Surely people are not more credulous now than they were in the first century. Anyone who insists that the resurrection accounts cannot be legendary simply opposes common sense. Getting back to Paul's testimony, let's get back to Paul's testimony. It gives no details. It does not mention the empty tomb, even though doing so would have strengthened Paul's case. It gives no place or date for the alleged resurrection. The Gospels and Acts know nothing of an appearance to the 500. Surely they would have reported such a remarkable event. Paul does not make clear whether the appearances were physical or visionary. The Greek text, folks, is entirely ambiguous on this point. More importantly, we know nothing of the reliability of any of the so-called witnesses. How reliable were Peter or James? How do we know that the 500, if they really existed, did not suffer a mass hallucination? What then about Paul's eyewitness testimony? As T.H. Huxley noted in a classic essay, if we accepted all of the eyewitness reports of miracles from old texts, we would be credulous indeed. Is Paul then particularly credible? On the contrary, Paul himself states that he was given to ecstatic visions. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul tells us of being caught up as far as the third heaven, verse 2. And not knowing whether he was in the body or out of it, verse 2 repeated in verse 3. He reports that he was caught up into paradise, verse 4, and that he heard words so secret that no human lips may repeat them, verse 4. Clearly, this is an account of a mystical vision. Why not conclude that Paul's experience of the risen Christ was of a similar kind? Now for the empty tomb legend. Professor Craig adduces Paul's testimony in the 1 Corinthians 15 formula that Jesus was buried as evidence for the empty tomb. But reciting such a liturgical formula no more implies knowledge of an empty tomb than singing John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave implies knowledge of where John Brown is buried. Professor Craig also argues that had the stories of the empty tomb been fictitious, the prejudices of the day would have dictated that they be discovered, that the accounts indicated that the discoverers of the empty tomb were men rather than women. But the gospel accounts say that the disciples fled into hiding with Jesus' arrest, leaving only the women to care for the body. Besides, the washing, wrapping, and anointing of bodies was women's work in those days. Therefore, it is utterly unsurprising that a fictional account would depict women as the discoverers of the empty tomb. More fundamentally, as the Right Reverend Bishop Shelby Spong says, quote, the discovery of an empty tomb would never have issued in an Easter faith. If there had been a tomb and if the tomb had been found empty, it would have meant only that one more insult had been delivered to the leader of the tiny Jesus movement. The disciples, whoever they were, would have concluded that even the dead body of this Jesus had not been spared degradation. No Easter faith would have resulted from an empty tomb. Therefore, such a tradition cannot have been primary. It was but a story incorporated later into the narrative. Professor Craig's third main piece of evidence for the resurrection is the origin of the Christian faith itself. He argues that the Christian faith in a resurrected Jesus has no precedent in Jewish thought. The Jewish conception of resurrection is a general raising of the dead at the end of time, not the raising to glory of a single individual as an event in history. Further, the Christian idea that the resurrection of the righteous will somehow hinge on the Messiah's resurrection was wholly unknown. Professor Craig concludes that these new Christian ideas were so radical that only the actual resurrection of Jesus can account for so extreme a conceptual shift. But according to the Gospels, Jesus' ministry contained many heretical elements. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus claims authority for the forgiveness of sins, which elicits a charge of blasphemy from the scribes. In Mark 7, he sets aside the traditional dietary distinctions between clean and unclean foods. In Mark 2:28, he even claims to be sovereign over the Sabbath. Further, Jesus' preaching was full of apocalyptic content. He famously said, "Truly I say unto you, There are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power. In Mark 8:31 and 10:34, he predicts that the Son of Man will die and rise 3 days later. Given the heretical and apocalyptic nature of their master's teachings and the experiences, whatever they were, that convinced them that Jesus had risen, the emergence of radically new concepts in the disciples' minds hardly seems to require supernatural explanation. For the early Christians, the resurrection of Jesus was the first eschatological event, an event that ushered in the new age, the coming of the kingdom. They believed that they were in the end times. In all honesty, folks, I simply do not see here a gaping, unbridgeable conceptual chasm between belief in a general resurrection at the end of time and the belief that Jesus' resurrection was the first event of the coming of the end times. In the presently fashionable lingo, paradigm shifts do occur. If Professor Craig insists that nonetheless, such a conceptual shift requires supernatural intervention, I simply have to ask, what are his criteria? At what point do concepts become so alien that it would require a miracle for someone to shift from one to the other? We need some such guidelines before the discussion can proceed. In conclusion, H.G. Wells one time said, "Every dogma has its day." Christianity's day has been rather long, 2,000 years. I think that's long enough. Thank you very much.